inherit a mess of problems: an enfeebled economy, crises in the cost of living and pay, inflation, public services and the public finances in a mess, labour shortages, and that's all without mentioning the B word. So in the run-up to the election, we're going to start looking at some of those massive headaches where Labour has room to manoeuvre on them and how to cajole our next government, if it's Labour, into the best possible place. This time, we're going to look at defence. On his way out as Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace warned of war on three fronts: a possible direct confrontation with Russia, a Cold War with China, and clashes with terror groups in Africa. After underfunding our armed forces for years, could Britain handle a major military operation? And what can Labour do about that? Arthur Snell is, of course, our one-man defence desk, but also here to help us through it all is politics professor at the University of Kent and senior fellow at UK in a Changing Europe, Richard Whitman. Welcome to the podcast, Richard.
Hello.
So can you give us, start off by giving us a kind of picture of the sort of military landscape Labour's going to inherit? Because it's been out of power for 13 years, perhaps lacking in expertise, but we have a very particular landscape right now.
We do. I mean, Labour is going to inherit the war in Ukraine, as all Europeans are going to have to cope with for the foreseeable future. It's also obviously going to have to cope in an environment in which defence is now sort of pretty front and centre. It's been a bit of a Cinderella, I think, over the last few years, certainly since the end of the military commitments in Iraq and Afghanistan. And now it's a real sort of front and centre focus, because what are we going to spend on defence? We have to spend more. And what are we going to do to fill in some of the gaps that exist? Because defence perhaps hasn't had the political attention that it's needed up until the outbreak of Russia's war in Ukraine.
Which is not what you'd expect from a Conservative government, but we are where we are, I suppose. The impression from outsiders like me is that we kind of let everything slide because of the supposed peace dividend at the end of the Cold War and then got caught badly out in Iraq and Afghanistan. Is that sort of back of a cigarette pack carton picture relatively accurate?
I think it's accurate probably for where the army found itself. And one of the things that the current government has done is we had a bit of a hiatus because of Brexit. There was the soaking up of huge amounts of political bandwidth where the government might have been thinking about what its place in the world could and should be. We went through a process in which they articulated this idea of global Britain, but it was a sort of slogan in search of content. And it wasn't it's until fairly recently, sort of early 2021, where we got a sense of what it might mean and in particular what the implications were for defence. We really did have a bit of a holiday, I would suggest, certainly between 2016 and 2021, when we could be thinking harder on defence and thinking harder about Britain's place in the world. And then the war in Ukraine, and nobody really had the luxury of thinking hard anymore. It was a case of getting on and dealing with this sort of major change in the security situation in Europe.
What are the specifics of what's going to be on Labour's plate then? Because we've just had the Conservatives' integrated defence review, which seemed to me, I may be completely wrong, but to be relatively inconclusive. What are Labour going to have to tackle in short order?
Well, I think they're probably going to view the world in the same way as the Tories do. So the kind of things that the government set out that we should worry about, like Russia, like China and so on, it's difficult to think how they'd be perverse and think about other things to worry about. And the front bench team have made clear that they're sort of in broad agreement with the things that the government's focused on, with the important exception of the European Union. But let's put that to one side for a moment. I think what the government's going to have to think quite hard about is how much does it want to spend on defence? The current Prime Minister has said he wants to raise defence expenditure to 2.5% of GDP. That's up from about 2% now. That's a big chunk of change in terms of government expenditure. Does Labour want to do that? How far is Labour going to commit to all of the things that the current government committed to? That's supporting Ukraine, obviously, but also the existing spending commitments and the kind of things the government has in place, like 2 aircraft carriers and so on, and all the things that's promised for the future, not least to build a sort of future aircraft with Japan and Italy, and the so-called AUKUS agreement, which means the UK is sort of locked into a defence relationship with the US and Australia on submarines, and that has some significant spending commitments for the UK, not least because it's going to base a submarine there, or is set to base a submarine in Australia from 2027, which would obviously fall in the time period of the next government.
Arthur, as Richard just alluded to, defence is sometimes the least kind of capital P political part of politics. You move in these circles. What will the defence community be lining up to tell the next defence secretary, whoever it may be?
Well, I think the defence community has always had the problem that it tells the politician that their service and their area of speciality is the neediest. And we do have this sort of tradition of a bit of inter-service rivalry. So the Navy will be saying, we've got to continue to run these massive aircraft carriers. The RAF, as Richard mentioned, they're developing this next generation fighter jet. The Army will be saying that the Army isn't big enough, and the Ukraine war points to the degree to which, a classic sort of armored conflict in sort of old style, Cold War style, as opposed to the more modern counterinsurgency ideas. So all these people are saying that their thing is a massive priority, and yet there isn't enough money for basic things like giving, military staff families adequate housing. And so in that sense, it's the least political, but you could argue it's just like all the other areas of politics where you've got decades of degradation of public service, and a bit like the NHS, working off the goodwill of the people who serve in it, in this case the armed forces, underpaying them, underfunding them, under-equipping them, and hoping that you can get away with it. And then suddenly you're faced with the prospect of a really serious war against a peer nation, not a small counterinsurgency on the other side of the world. And you realise that you just don't have adequate resources.
You've been all over Ukraine for Doomsday Watch, obviously, and we have sent Ukraine a lot of stuff, as sort of physical material as well as intangible support. Do you think Ukraine has been a bit of a wake up for British defence?
Yeah, it has, and for all NATO allies. So in two ways: one, that ultimately that you do have to focus on the security of Europe. That for a long time NATO's main effort was Afghanistan, which right now looks pretty quaint. But the other point is actually, and this came up in the most recent, this so-called Defence Command paper that came out this week, is the inadequacy of our defence industrial complexes across Europe. Ironic in a way, because of course, on the left, some people talk darkly about the defence industrial complex or taking over politics. We don't have an industrial base that can manufacture things like ammunition for artillery, things like those famous Javelin and NLAW anti-tank missiles. The Ukrainians have used them all up. We can't really make new ones quick enough. We've enjoyed, of course, peacetime in Europe, and that's a wonderful thing, and we can all be very happy for that. But what's happened is that what you might call our national defence, by which I mean industrial, societal resilience, in addition to the armed forces themselves, has been completely degraded, and we're basically not tooled to deal with a wartime situation.
Hannah, defence has never been a favourite with the Labour rank and file. The party does have its roots in things like CND and even the Peace Pledge Union years ago. Can you see defence getting priority from a cash-strapped Labour government that can't even lift a two-child cap?
Yes, but potentially because I think that the roots of the party are not where it is now. If you think about the Blair years, obviously he very much reset the relationship with defence and military intervention, of course, not without significant criticism. But
don't mention the war.
Don't mention the war. But I think Labour became more comfortable during that era with having these conversations about defence. And Starmer has been much closer to Sunak than you might have imagined, certainly around the Ukraine crisis. And he's actually pushed Sunak very hard on commitments around defence, suggesting, in fact, that the current review doesn't go far enough. When the government was preparing for the review and talked about 10,000 cuts to troop numbers, he absolutely rejected that and said, that this is not the time for those kind of cuts. We can't justify it. It's a dangerous suggestion. So I think he is actually, as a leader now of Labour, in a position to show some authority actually on defence. But there's also another element, actually, in terms of pacifying the Mail, the Telegraph. Yes, it will pacify the leader writers. But actually, I'm not so sure about the readership, because if you look at the data around public perception on where we should be putting money into public services, the support for defence isn't as unanimous as you might expect, even with the Ukraine crisis ongoing. So it's not necessarily a publicly, an immediate public vote winner to be pro-defence, pro-extra troop numbers, even if it does pacify some writers in the, the boardrooms of those newspapers.
Yeah. Richard, before we started the podcast, you and I spoke about, what are the big unmentionables, the great big things, the big elephants in the room. And you mentioned three things: nuclear weapon renewal, recruitment, which we touched on already, and Scottish independence, if it were to happen, which would leave the rest of the UK with nowhere to moor the nuclear submarines, or and sort of deprive us of a lot of our access to those kind of strategic, sea lanes or whatever it is. Can you put a bit more flesh on the bones? Firstly, nuclear weapons, obviously vastly expensive. Where are we in the kind of cycle of renewing them?
Well, we're right in the middle of a big cycle, which is we're sort of switching over from the existing fleet submarines to a new fleet. And this is phenomenally expensive. I mean, if you look at the plans for defence spending over the next 10 years, it's heading towards about a third of the spending on equipment is going to go on these submarines. Two are well under the way to being built. The third one has just been started. And obviously then there's the nuclear weapons that go on board. I mean, this also, to connect to others' points, is this is also highly skilled labour involved in constructing these. And this is, I think, something that obviously plays well with the trade union movement. These are very skilled jobs. There aren't enough people, frankly, who are apprenticed and able to work on those programs. And that's one of the things that the government has flagged up, that there is a labour problem in these areas. And we need to look at how we upskill the workforce to build these. But it is a major order commitment. But it's also obviously one that politically has caused problems on the left in the past. But when the vote was taken in Parliament to embark on this renewal in 2016, it was cross-party agreement. But it is phenomenally expensive. If you're going to carry on doing it, and it's difficult to see how the government would back out, could possibly back out on the 4 submarine, but it wouldn't make the deterrent work in the way that works at the moment. It is a very, very big financial commitment. It takes up a significant proportion of what we're planning to spend on defence, and obviously locks the next government, whatever that might be, into that commitment.
And Scottish independence is one I hadn't even sort of factored in, but the idea that most of the deep water ports that submarines require could, the tide of Scottish independence seems to have ebbed quite significantly this year, but it's not impossible. Where does that leave a British nuclear fleet?
Well, where we have the fleet based at the moment, one of the things that we provide the US is the basing for those submarines in Scotland. They could be relocated, and work's been done to look at how they could be relocated to England. But obviously, it's also incredibly expensive as well. So you'd be taking on an additional cost if you were to see Scottish independence. You'd also be losing the bases and other training facilities that you had in Scotland. Perhaps Scottish independence is a bit like Brexit. I mean, we didn't really think about what the cost or consequence of the Brexit process would be. If you look at government documents, obviously they're not going to flag up the fact that Scottish independence would be something that would be have considerable impact on the UK's security and defence. And of course, the Scottish government is committed to being non-nuclear, but also wants to be in NATO. So it has its own problems to square. But it's the sort of untalked about, unthought about, and too difficult to think about question. And obviously, it goes into abeyance as the Scottish National Party has slipped in terms of the position that it's had in setting the agenda on Scottish independence.
Arthur, a lot of listeners will be probably shouting at whatever they play this podcast on, going, but what about cyber? You're talking about conventional warfare, you're talking about planes and boats and infantry and so forth, but actually cyber warfare is likely to be more of the forefront, not just in terms of conflicts between states, but in terms of protecting our own democracies. Do you think that the incoming Labour cabinet and the defence components of Labour is alive to this and understands the concerns?
I'm going to be honest, I don't know to what extent they are, but I think what you've got in the current Labour setup is that fairly sort of non-ideological, pragmatic perspective. And clearly, this is a very technical area, particularly when you're getting into cyber, but defence in general. And, you tend to have not that many former servicemen and women on the Labour side of politics. So you don't have that phenomenon that you normally see with the Tories, where someone who's been in the army and therefore thinks they know it all already. So my hope would be that Labour will go and listen to what the experts, both inside defence, but also, in the wider community, people including Richard and others, in the academic community, because there's a lot to learn. But I mean, you mentioned cyber, and what's interesting is now that people talk about 5 domains of warfare. So we all know about land, sea and air, and then cyber and space. And I suppose for years, people have sort of wondered about those, but those are now real. And again, the Ukraine war has shown the degree to which extremely fast-moving cyber defense and offense is absolutely crucial to modern warfare. There are drones that are launched that might work one day and then the next day they've been jammed, and so you need to find a way around that, or if you're defending, find a way to jam the drones. And those sorts of things are happening at a really fast speed. So in a weird way, and obviously it's tragic, but in a weird way, our country and all modern sort of military powers are learning huge amounts from the Ukraine war.
Yeah, I think Wallace called it a laboratory of war, didn't he, the other day?
Yeah.
Which is a chilling thought, but kind of true, I guess. Not to leave Hannah out of this, but we have to tap the expertise of people who really know what they're on about here.
That's absolutely fine.
I want to ask both of you, firstly, the magic wand question, and secondly, the realistic question. What would you most like to see in terms of a change of defence policy? And secondly, what do you think we're going to get? Richard, can we start with you? What do we mostly need from the next government, and what are we most likely to get?
Maybe not to answer the question directly, but a Trump presidency would really create significant problems for whatever government is in power, and would really throw up all sorts of questions for the way that the Ukraine war is being fought, the way that the NATO alliance operates, and so on and so on. So, in terms of sort of Labour's prayers, if you like, I think that would be one of the things that you'd definitely want to pray for not happening, because it would just take up a huge amount of time, energy and effort, just sort of backfilling all the stuff that you have now. I think the one thing that Labour could do most usefully is to sort out something that Arthur touched on, which is the state of the package that's on offer to service people, which is the housing, the pay, the general terms and conditions for people who commit and serve in the military, which are frankly disgraceful, and the defence estate, and particularly the housing aspect, is a long-running scandal. We haven't allowed rates pay, particularly at the bottom end in the military, really to keep up with what we need. And those are going to have to improve significantly if you're going to recruit the kind of people that are going to be needed, that are comfortable with technology, have the skills that are going to be needed for this new form of warfare, which is more sort of digitally interconnected. And you won't get that if you can't offer an attractive place to work.
I get the nasty feeling that when we raise every single one of these sectors in shows to come, the conclusion is going to be you're going to need to fix the pay and conditions and invest in everything, fill in the blank here. Arthur, what do our armed services need and our general defence establishment need, and what are we likely to get?
Well, I think one suggestion, which is almost, very unusually one that doesn't involve more money, is actually the change in culture around equipment. So there's a particular thing which the British military in general has fallen into, which is this idea that any new piece of equipment has to be specially adapted and made unique for the British military. And there are countless case studies of this, leading to endless delays and cost overruns. And you can talk about the SA-80 rifle, which became a sort of it's like one of those weird animals that people make, which is a sort of half a human and half a dragon and half a whatever.
Oh, like the car that Homer Simpson designs. Remember when Homer Simpson designs a car? Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And so you have that phenomenon, again, the Ajax fighting vehicle. There are so many of these case studies, and something that Ben Wallace, but also James Heappey, the Armed Forces Minister, was saying when they presented this Defence Command paper is that they've got to get past that and the sort of 80-20 principle that actually, again, something they've seen from Ukraine is just getting kit that works, that you can put into the field and use, has got to be more important than spending 12 years perfecting the perfect rifle that by the time it's used by all the soldiers is obsolete. Now, the problem with that is that the British military have been saying this for decades. So they're going to become more pragmatic and more sensible and more off the shelf and less bespoke. And then they never seem to change to that. I just wonder whether the combination of seeing the reality of modern warfare in Ukraine, plus the real fiscal crisis we're in, will mean that they do actually do that. And what that would do is will save defence a lot of money and actually mean that kit, maybe not the best kit ever invented, but really quite good kit, reaches our, armed forces in a timely fashion. And that seems like, and that is a cultural change rather than something involving, the magic money tree.
Just to wrap up then, obviously the thing that hangs over all of this is what will Putin do next? Will he expand the war? Will he attempt to draw other countries into it? Is Britain in a fit state to handle expanded land war in Europe? Would we simply be bystanders?
I think the short answer is probably not if it was an extended conflict. But in the short term, I mean, Britain has sort of put its best foot forward, I think, in terms of the kind of tripwire that NATO has if Putin was to cross into NATO territory. But this is where the hard choices have to be made by the UK in the future. It's spending money on nuclear. It's got an expensive navy now with 2 aircraft carriers. It wants to have these future aircraft. It wants to do stuff in the Indo-Pacific. But as we saw with the Defence Command paper yesterday, it really comes down to bottom line with what we've got in Europe now. How do you best defend the UK in Europe? And what mix do you need to have in the armed forces to do that? And are you willing to spend more on defence? Because that is what it would mean, more on defence to allow the UK to make more of a contribution to the defence against Russia.
Arthur?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously one aspect of what we've learned from the Ukraine war is that the Russian military is in a pretty parlous state. And not that we should be at all complacent about that, but what we're seeing is the Ukrainians heroically on behalf of the rest of Europe massively degrading Russian military. So I think the probability of a large war in Europe spreading beyond Ukraine, I think remains very low. But what we mustn't forget is all the other stuff that's still going on, such as the possibility of some kind of conflict between the US and China, the challenges associated with the climate crisis, which are not necessarily military ones, but they're certainly security ones. And then the fact that whilst the Russian army does seem to be in a bit of a mess, going back into Russian history, this sort of willingness to suffer more may be the way that they can sort of grind out some kind of a sort of frozen conflict victory. And that doesn't make us feel much safer in Britain.
Well, I hope the future cabinet is listening closely to all this. We'll be keeping an eye in future. Richard, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.